Good morning, everyone, and welcome virtually to the Center for a New American Security. My name is Daniel Schneiderman, and I am an adjunct senior fellow in the Middle East Security Program here at the Center. We're here today to discuss how the region's security environment and U.S. policy have been affected by the conflict currently underway between Israel and Iran. Israel's June 13th initiation of a campaign against Iran's nuclear program and military leadership, and the subsequent strikes by the United States on key parts of Iran's nuclear program have had a profound impact on current events. They also have the potential to reshape the region and the U.S.'s engagement in it, as well as affecting broad U.S. national security and defense policy for years to come. This campaign raises several important questions about the U.S.'s posture, presence, and policy in the Middle East that I think are worth diving into. The U.S. has, for successive presidential administrations, committed to treating China as the pacing threat and focusing on an era of strategic competition. Since October 7, 2023, that focus has been harder to master as the war in Gaza and other events in the region have required a significant amount of U.S. resources and commitment of political capital. That reality doesn't seem set to change anytime soon. With Iran and Israel agreeing to a tenuous ceasefire brokered by the U.S. and Gulf states, an off-ramp from escalation, however tenuous, is now available, and a chance for diplomacy exists. What it can achieve is an open question, and one we will hope to get at in today's discussion. I'm thrilled to be joined by three great panelists, all of whom have deep experience working on U.S. policy towards the region from various vantage points, including the Defense Department, Congress, the NGO community, and the private sector. I'd like to introduce Rachel Brandenburg, the Washington Managing Director and Senior Fellow at the Israel Policy Forum, Liz Dent, a Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and Adham Salul, an Adjunct Senior Fellow here at CNAS. Thank you to each of you for being here. I'll ask each of you to offer some brief opening comments and then leave us with one salient fact you'd like to share with the audience as a jumping off point for our discussion. If I could turn first to Rachel. Rachel, if you could talk us through your perspective on the Israeli decision to launch these strikes and ostensibly rule out a diplomatic solution to this crisis. I'd also love to hear if you can talk about how the U.S. decision to launch its own strikes against these facilities validates the Israeli decision to take action at this moment in time.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks so much for having me. I'm pleased to be here with this group of experts and be able to speak on the CNAS platform. Yeah, the last or the 12 days of war prior to the ceasefire, about 48 hours ago now, came as a surprise to many, but I think also less of a surprise to some. Prime Minister Netanyahu in particular and Israelis for years have been talking about how Iran's nuclear program or Iran having a nuclear weapon would be an existential threat to Israel. And both the Israeli government and to some extent the Israeli public have sort of been primed for years that Israel would have to do whatever it takes to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. So I think for Prime Minister Netanyahu, watching President Trump trying to achieve a deal and noting the 60-day clock that President Trump had put on his negotiations when he started it, considered a window of opportunity, both because diplomacy wasn't necessarily going in the direction that Prime Minister Netanyahu or even President Trump wanted it to, because the 60-day clock had run out, and because over the past couple of years, Israel has effectively decimated the Iranian proxy capabilities around its borders, particularly Hamas and Hezbollah through its campaign last year. So for the first time, Israel found itself in an environment where the likelihood of proxies coming to Iran's defense was very, very low. And what we saw was they didn't. Hezbollah stood down. Hamas doesn't have capabilities. Even the Houthis, who had been sort of lobbing missiles over at Israel for quite some time now, didn't change their behavior and to some extent muted their behavior amidst Israel's war with Iran. The Israelis and Prime Minister Netanyahu have been trying to convince President Trump since day one of this administration that they needed to strike, and President Trump preferred diplomacy. I think we still see, and I look forward to discussing this more, that President Trump prefers diplomacy to actually bring this challenge to a close. The strikes have achieved a lot, but you can't bomb Iran's nuclear capabilities and nuclear knowledge and the entirety of its program out of existence. So the next phase, and arguably the more complicated phase, will now be, hopefully, diplomacy and negotiations to turn the ceasefire into a more sustainable peace. President Trump's decision to go into the war was interesting. He has long campaigned on not wanting to get the United States into war, to bring the United States out of wars, to make deals, and to bring, I think that he uses peace with a capital P a lot in some of his tweets, right? Peace and prosperity and stability, all good things. He seems to have made the decision that US strikes could not only deliver capabilities that the Israelis didn't have, but I expect bring a quicker end to the war. And from what it seems, that objective was achieved. Once the US came in, Prime Minister Netanyahu was more quickly able to say, okay, we've done what we can. I don't want this to be a war of attrition. The Iranians were, to some extent, brought to their knees and been looking to come back to the negotiating table for days prior to the ceasefire. And so all parties were able to de-escalate a little bit. I think now we'll have to see what happens moving forward. Does the ceasefire hold? Does it turn into something more sustainable? And what can be done about Iran's nuclear ambitions?
Great. Thanks, Rachel. I think that's a really good starting point for us. Next, Liz, I'd love to turn to you to get a sense of how U.S. allies in the Gulf have perceived both Israeli and U.S. actions to date. While I think it's clear that all of them have been opposed to Iran's obtaining a nuclear weapon, they must be balancing a number of competing priorities between the risk of retaliation from Iran being very tangible for them. Were they ultimately supportive of what's been done? And can you talk a little about the role that some of the Gulf states have played in trying from the beginning to de-escalate the crisis? I think that would be helpful for the audience.
Sure. Thank you, Dan. And thanks to CNAS for hosting this discussion. It's obviously a very timely one. I'm also really honored to be here with Rachel and Adham, who I've both been privileged to work with in the past. So it's really nice to see you guys here. I think Rachel's such a tough act to follow, but I think I would just add that obviously the past few weeks have been incredibly unpredictable and frankly, a pretty big shift from the policies that we expected that the Trump administration would pursue in the Middle East. These coordinated Israeli strikes on the Iranian nuclear infrastructure that is now drawn in, obviously a little bit more of a limited U.S. involvement is a very drastic shift from Trump's stated policy of letting the region handle itself and his trip to the Gulf just last month, where he was advocating for a lot of these partnerships to be rooted in economic and technology-based structure. So what's clear is that this has been a threshold crossing series of events and that there continues to be no military solution to the Iranian nuclear challenge or what it could do in the region. So I think the question really becomes, what did these military operations enable to actually happen? So I'll just make 3 quick points on that. The first is that regardless of how much the nuclear program has actually been set back, it has in fact been set back. Coupled with Iran's limited response and pre-notification of its retaliation to Qatar, and it knew that Qatar would inform the United States, this could help lay the groundwork for the United States and Iran to return to the negotiating table. Second, the military planning that went into these US strikes took pretty great pains to avoid and as well as acknowledge that a lot of our friends in the region, particularly in the Gulf, did not want to be caught in the crosshairs. So we had the B-2s take off from Missouri, you had munitions fired from a submarine. Despite how many bases and assets the US is maintaining in the Gulf region, the US worked very hard to avoid utilizing those assets in order to preserve those partnerships and ensure that the blowback did not fall on our partners. Now, obviously, in Qatar's case, that didn't hold true, but still, like, the planning that went into that did take pains to protect those partnerships. And then third, the US's response to Iran's retaliation against Al Udeid in Qatar helped reaffirm a lot of these American security guarantees to Gulf partners that I think they have been seeking for quite some time. So I think now the question really becomes, can Trump get back to what he wants to actually do in the region? And will the Israelis and the Iranians give the opportunity for a new Middle East to actually emerge? To do so, the US has to focus on leading diplomatically. They have to focus on defining realistic end states, reassuring those regional partners that this is not going to be a prolonged or protracted conflict, and that the partnerships will remain intact and are still transitioning over to the economic base that Trump has proclaimed that they will be. And that's also about, preserving our long-term strategic interests, which Trump himself has defined as rooted in these economic and technological partnerships. I'll just close really quickly with my salient fact, which is that we saw something that only the United States can really do in the region, and that was provide this air defense for Qatar. The successful interception of these Iranian missiles over Doha, which were targeting Al Udeid Air Base, is the result of years of training with the United States, U.S. equipment, early warning systems, intelligence sharing, ironclad security cooperation, and military partnership, and a lot of these US-led regional security integration efforts. And it builds off of the success of this air defense coalition, which occurred last April. And it clearly is continuing to work today. So that is a good thing for us to see. I think the Gulf partners were concerned about the blowback, but will be reassured by the success of how this US-led defense works.
Lindsay, that's a really great setting of the table for the Gulf view on all this and the importance of the strategic partnerships that the U.S. has in the region. Adham, if I could come to you next, I think early reports on the ceasefire and reactions by both Iran and Israel declaring some sort of victory suggest that there is investment on both sides in trying to take an off-ramp and not see the conflict escalate. That said, it seems likely that there will be an elevated level of threat to U.S. forces for some time to come. How do you think U.S. officials should be thinking about threats they face across the region to the U.S. personnel present in the region?
Certainly. Thank you, Dan. And it's a privilege to be joining you, Rachel, Liz, and CNAS at this moment. I think what's clear is that this veil of Iran's proxy groups and the shadow war, so to speak, that Iran has been waging against the United States since the Islamic Revolution. Think of the 1983 Marine barracks bombing in Lebanon, for instance, has been lifted. Iran has demonstrated its willingness to directly target U.S. forces along with U.S. allies with ballistic missiles, as Liz illustrated, firing at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar yesterday, as well as Bahrain, Kuwait, and Iraq. Now, in terms of U.S. force protection, there's at least 40,000 U.S. troops in the region on land and at sea. U.S. bases around the region are all within range rings of Iran's depleted yet potent arsenal of short, medium, and long-range ballistic missiles, as well as an increasingly sophisticated arsenal of drones. Areas like Iraq and eastern Syria are, I think, well established as places where U.S. forces face a higher threat of targeting by Iran or Iranian proxy groups. Residual proxy networks in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, despite recent degradation, can certainly conduct asymmetric attacks. There's a threat of terrorism, not just to U.S. military, embassy, and government personnel, but also to citizens of the region, dual U.S. citizens and government personnel of the partner nations. Will impact tourists and businesses across the region. Think of U.S. Fortune 500 companies focusing either on tech and AI, telecoms, energy, and aviation. Those may all be, potential targets for asymmetric attacks, missile and drone attacks, as well as cyber warfare that the Iranians have demonstrated willingness to undertake. Now, the Trump administration has prioritized in its agenda the fortunes of a new Syria, a new Levant, so to speak, curbing Iranian influence in Lebanon as well. Iran can still activate a depleted Hezbollah and networks among Assad regime remnants, as well as Iraqi Shia militias and political parties that have, for the most part, been deterred in the post-October 7th security environment. We should remember as well Iran's historic ties to al-Qaeda and extremist offshoots, Sunni extremists, not just Shia sectarian militias, that might have a bone to pick with the new interim government in Syria or this new Middle East that is taking form. The Houthis of Yemen as well remain a threat with an increasingly sophisticated arsenal of missiles and drones who have proven the willingness and ability to threaten commercial traffic in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, as well as directly target U.S. and allied vessels. And the far graver maritime security challenge, I would say, is any continued Iranian saber rattling regarding the Strait of Hormuz choke point, where over a fifth of the world's oil exports flow out of the Arabian Gulf, and where even the threat of targeting or mining can cause energy and commercial shipping companies, as well as insurance companies, to de-risk with potentially devastating ripple effects to the global economy. Not something that I think President Trump wants to see. The Arab Gulf states, as Liz illustrated, remain targets where Iran can continue to try to drive a wedge between the US and its allies, where Iran can make the case to the average citizen of those nations that the cost of being America's ally or having one's government signed on to the Abraham Accords or any future regional integration project is high. The Trump administration will likely focus on continuing to shore up air and missile defense of Arab Gulf allies who participate in U.S. military operations and coalitions and who host U.S. forces. And that will involve continued placement and at times diversion of missile defense batteries and battalions, which I know will take us to the conversation that you mentioned, Dan, about the opportunity costs in the Indo-Pacific. What we can also anticipate is that the successful use case of Qatar's Patriot batteries against the barrage of Iranian missiles, certainly demonstrates the interoperability and the use case for coordination with U.S. forces. And that will continue to drive the case for foreign military sales for U.S. defense systems and deepening defense cooperation with the U.S. across the region. We will certainly see deepened intelligence sharing and defense cooperation against the Iran threat network, especially to curb these asymmetric threats. But in the medium to long term, the U.S. should learn from these past 18 months and look to drive down the political cost of regional government security and intelligence cooperation with the United States. And that starts with making sure that diplomats, military officers, leaders, and citizens of partner nations don't feel that being America's ally means turning your neighborhood into a target for Iranian drones or missiles. And ideally, that being America's ally does not mean co-signing Israel's challenges to territorial integrity of its neighbors or Prime Minister Netanyahu's devastating campaign in Gaza.
Great, Adham. It's a really good laydown of the sort of threat picture in the region writ large. And I think what all of you have had to say in the opening gives us a number of rich areas for discussion. So the first thing I want to do is pose a question to all of our panelists that says that, look, we've all seen the reports that initial battle damage assessments, while suggesting significant damage to the sites that the United States struck, are at best unclear about the amount of long-term impact on Iran's nuclear program, and at worst may have only set the program back for a few months. Given the uncertainty surrounding the state of Iran's nuclear program, I'd love to hear from each of you, starting with Liz, if I could, whether you think that the United States and Israel are likely to have achieved the aims of the campaign, or will further military action be on the table if and when both parties sense that Iran has successfully reconstituted its program or is racing toward a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So I think in President Trump's case, at least, I think he expected this to be a one and done bombing campaign. I think he has no desire to make this a prolonged or protracted military campaign. I don't think that it's something he wouldn't revisit in the future if there was a new assessment done that said things were imminent again. But I think he wants to sort of wash his hands and be done with this. For the Israelis, I'm not sure what that means for them. I think that they'll have to conduct an assessment. And I think it'll take either that assessment to tell them whether or not they're ready and willing to sort of step back and not continue a bombing campaign. If they see Iran come back to the negotiating table with the United States, that could potentially sway them one direction. But obviously, if they're seeing no negotiations take place, they're seeing the assessment as they saw it previously, then I would expect that they could potentially continue that campaign.
Great, thanks, Rachel. I'd love to know your thoughts on the Israeli perspective here.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I completely agree with Liz on both the U.S. and the Israelis. I think for the Israelis, it's important to remember that they have, in some ways, been living a very slow boil war of attrition since October 7th, with sort of the big, terrible blast on October 7th and missiles coming at them from one direction or another almost consistently since October 8th. And so this was a whole new level of destruction and pain from individual missiles. Israel's missile defense system still worked, but any one Iranian missile that got through had a bigger payload, it would just cause far more destruction than what Israelis have seen from Iran's proxies on its borders and Hamas. It's a far more sophisticated weapon. So Prime Minister Netanyahu said a few days ago, and I think it's true, he's not interested in a war of attrition with Iran. Their objective was to at least halt Iran's nuclear program through this use of force. They say Iran cannot have a nuclear weapons program, so I don't think they'll take force off the table entirely. But I think there is recognition that that should happen through diplomacy. And I'm hopeful that this war will give the negotiations a little bit more breathing space than they had previously. Iran's capabilities have been severely degraded, as you said, whether by months or years, we'll have to see. Ideally, the IAEA gets in there at some point and verifies. I'm not sure we can trust Israeli or Iranian assessments given their vested interests and sort of what they put on the table. Even this morning, we saw a fairly odd statement from the White House that was quoting Israeli intelligence assessments on behalf of Israel, and then Israel put it out. It's sort of a mishmash of what actually happened, whether people are pulling from different intelligence assessments or, candidly, in this day and age, just making things up. We don't know. But I expect everyone would prefer to avert war. For Israel, they also still have the Gaza war. So that hasn't ended. I am hopeful that this could give Prime Minister Netanyahu some breathing space politically to end it, but we'll have to see what direction he goes. But Israeli reservists are still fighting in Gaza. Soldiers are still fighting in Gaza. Just last night or this morning, Israel time, it was announced that 7 soldiers were killed in an APC blast, which brings back memories to me of the Iraq war for the United States, right? There's a lot still happening in Israeli society on top of the trauma of the last 2 years, that there's a real interest in not having a whole other war sustained with Iran.
Anham, I'd love to know your thoughts on this as well.
Certainly. Put simply, the question is whether President Trump, the United States, can capitalize on the potential military success. We still don't know with proper battle damage assessment and the leaks in the press of unauthorized disclosures to the press of what may or may not have been a success. But a prospective military success of a depleted and geopolitically humbled Iran should be coupled with sound diplomacy and statecraft to achieve a sustainable outcome in the region. Iran's leaders are certainly calculating whether to rebuild their deterrent capabilities or to accept limitations in exchange for sanctions relief and normalized relations with Tehran's neighbors. That's all on the table. This is precisely the moment where you want the adults in the room to all be singing the same tune. We have seen at various times Special Envoy Witkoff, Secretary Rubio, and of course President Trump having different messages. It would be good to know what the United States' position is on whether or not we are pursuing another maximum pressure campaign, another prolonged conflict, or whether there are off-ramps available for Tehran. An Iran deal that positions the United States for strategic competition, right-sizing U.S. troop and resource allocation in the Middle East, would be a triumph for the United States. If Sunday's operation, however, only served to kick the can down the road for a few months or years, embolden Iran to make a sprint for a nuclear weapon, or encourages the Netanyahu government or future government in Israel to continue leading with a military option, to continue, quote unquote, mowing the lawn, or if Iran and Iran policy in the Middle East consumes years of political capital and military resources, certainly of the second and last Trump administration, that would be another missed opportunity for the American people and the people of the region.
Yeah, you make a very good point about the level of political commitment, Adham. If I can just follow up on that particular question, you've written recently at some length about what the commitment of U.S. time and resources to the Middle East means for U.S. strategic priorities. What do you think the long-term significance of the deployment of resources to the Middle East for the U.S.'s ability to undertake effective deterrence against its strategic competitors like China means? Maybe you could talk a little bit about the dynamic and what it takes to support not just 1 but 2 carrier strike groups that are currently deployed in the region, right? I mean, that is a significant commitment of resources and also political capital on behalf of the United States. So talk us through a little bit of that perspective, if you could.
Certainly. Thanks, Dan. So I'll say that how the United States has managed crises and alliances in the Middle East has become the ultimate stress test of American leadership in this era of strategic competition. We talk about prioritizing, we talk about Asia first, we talk about, quote unquote, getting out of the sandbox. But the Middle East remains the prevalent military theater of U.S. foreign policy for over now 2 decades. To illustrate how today's events impact U.S. long-range strategic interests, in 2025, this year, U.S. aircraft carriers have spent more days deployed in the Middle East than in the Indo-Pacific region. And that ratio is likely to grow. The U.S., as you mentioned, Dan, has 2 carrier strike groups, the Vincent and the Nimitz, supporting operations in the U.S. Central Command area of responsibility. And the Gerald Ford Carrier Strike Group is also en route to the region. Let's look at the other side of the coin. In 2024, at the height of the post-October 7th regional crisis, China's infrastructure deals in the Middle East totaled at around $39 billion, a 102% increase from the previous year, making the Middle East China's top partner for global infrastructure projects. All while the United States deployed over $18 billion in military assets, managing regional crises, including the Red Sea, where China essentially cut a deal with Yemen's Houthis, free-riding, a global power that is free-riding for safe passage of its own vessels and trade. The bottom line is that even though Iran, who has been essentially China's blunt instrument in the region for challenging U.S. influence, even though Iran has been severely weakened and geopolitically humbled, China continues to grow its regional footprint and influence while the United States absorbs security and reputational costs. Having worked on both China and the Middle East in government, I have the privilege of listening to conversations in both policy communities, and I'll tell you, it's a tale of 2 cities. Analysts have raised concern about the fact that the U.S. has, as we mentioned, the carrier strike groups, 2 and counting in the Middle East, as well as 6 destroyers in the area in support of our allies and partners' layered missile defense. There's also the concern that in the past few weeks, of the limited inventory of Patriot missile batteries, terminal high altitude area defense or THAAD systems, as well as the U.S. burning through its arsenal of interceptors, munitions for these systems that we all know are critical for air and missile defense in any potential conflict scenario involving China. Now, if you don't believe the analysts, listen to the acting chief of naval operations, Admiral James Kilby, who testified on Capitol Hill a few days ago that the United States is expending its arsenal of SM-3s and other surface-to-air missile interceptors at, and I quote, an alarming rate. Today's crisis means that one more strike group, a Patriot Defense Battalion, F-35 Squadron, has been redirected from the Indo-Pacific or Europe to the Middle East. And beyond resourcing and opportunity costs, every time we extend unconditional support to allies who then constrain our policy options, the world takes note. Our adversaries and our allies are studying U.S. alliance management, our alliance management model to understand whether American leadership is strategically coherent and confused. And the Trump administration has an opportunity to sort of break that cycle.
Right. I think you laid out a really good perspective on the resource cost. Rachel, I want to come back to you on an angle of this question, which is, look, the Israelis have been conducting a full-scale campaign since October 7th, both in Gaza and in Lebanon, and now against Iran. How does the level of sustainment that the Israelis have had to put forth in what they've done in their military operations affect their need to rely increasingly as time goes on U.S. support for defense of Israel's territory proper?
It's a good question. I think, there's 2 different pieces of it. There's the conducting the operations and the sustainment. And a lot of the sustainment is sort of the defensive posture. But since October 7th, Israel, because they were so caught off guard on their border, we're seeing kind of a new security paradigm where they're trying to push threats as far territorially back away from their own border as possible. And that requires forces, it requires holding territory. We saw in Lebanon, despite the ceasefire that required Israel to withdraw, they've maintained a presence on 5 outposts sort of along the border, but on the Lebanese side. And similarly in Syria, after Assad fell, they did airstrikes and took out all of the military assets that they could at the same night. But then over the next couple of months, they established a presence, and I think it's 7 different sites within Syrian territory over the border. That requires forces, that requires sustainment. Those aren't quite as full-blown campaigns as we saw in the war in Gaza or even in Iran over the past few days. And Iran in particular was the Air Force without land forces. Hopefully we don't see land forces anywhere near there. But all of these take resources. I think what Adham was talking about with interceptors is one of the biggest concerns, that there are only so many to go around and you can't produce those overnight. I think Israel will continue to rely on the US and this sort of informal regional coalition that Liz talked about for defense. For offense, I think it's a little different. Back in kind of the counter-ISIS days, when the US and Israel and Russia all had slightly different interests in Syria, and the US wasn't going to intervene on behalf of Israel in the way that Israel was interested in the US doing in Syria, Israel established this doctrine of we're going to take care of ourselves. We're going to do what we have to do to worry about our own security. That applied to Iranian proxies in Syria. It applied to Hezbollah. It sort of applied to Israel's immediate neighbors. I think we saw that carried out with Israel's war against Iran too. Whether or not Trump gave them the green light or a yellow light, who knows what the conversation was between Trump and Netanyahu beforehand. I'm confident that Trump was not, or at least the United States was not caught off guard, because we were ready with sort of a defensive posture to help defend Israel against Iranian retaliation. But I think they will try and do what they can with respect to offensive action themselves and sort of make their own plans. They will not be able to defend their air entirely by themselves. And this regional defense architecture that has emerged and the United States has been working to build for years. As Liz said, we saw it in action on April 13th. Was it a year and a half ago? We've probably seen it in action again over the last couple of weeks. That is in Israel's interest and every other regional actor's interest, and in the US interest, to continue building and growing and sustaining so that the region can kind of help take care of itself. And it's not the US who is coming in as the primary actor every time there's another military conflagration.
I agree. And I thought, Rachel, you also brought up something important about the counter-ISIS fight. And Liz, I'd love to ask you about the implications of the last 2 weeks for counter-ISIS efforts in the region writ large. I mean, we've seen that in the last 6 months, ISIS has been able to reconstitute itself somewhat in Syria, even as the U.S. pulls its forces out. What do you think the implications for the counter-ISIS fight are from the events of the last 2 weeks?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there is an impact on the fight against ISIS. The U.S. is distracted. It's also sort of undergoing this consolidation of its bases in Syria. It's planning for a withdrawal from Iraq in 2026. And we know that ISIS exploits security vacuums. They take advantage of unguarded territory, gaps in governance. So we've seen this happen a little bit in Syria, I think, post-Assad. And of course, I think it's possible that this potential drain in attention could also drain resources from the counter-ISIS priorities. But as recently as last month, I think it was late May, that the US and the Iraqi forces were still conducting joint operations. They had announced that they had done a number of raids and arrested folks. We've also seen the Iraqi military's capacity improve significantly over the last several years. And we're still a little bit away from that 2026 deadline for a US drawdown. I think we're about 1 year and 4 months away from the deadline. So I think that there is obviously cause for concern if we start seeing an increase in attacks, which like we did last summer, like we may see in Syria, just given that there has been a changeover in government. But if we start seeing that in Iraq, I think that the prioritization will shift. But if this is going to be a more protracted military campaign, I think that's when we would really start to worry about a shift in resourcing and prioritization. But I think for right now, I I think we just have to wait and see whether or not this ceasefire will stay in place, whether or not we will return to the negotiating table with Iran, and whether or not we actually do take away any resourcing from the counter-ISIS campaign. Obviously, it would be difficult in Iraq if the military campaign between the United States, Israel, and Iran continued, and potentially a lot of the Iranian-aligned militia groups could put pressure on the Iraqi government to have the U.S. and coalition forces leave even sooner than September 2026. I mean, those are all risks that could happen from a protracted military campaign. So I think we're hoping for the best, which would be that this is where it ends. The ceasefire stays in place. We return to the negotiating table, but sort of playing out what could happen if it doesn't.
Yeah, that's great, and I agree. It's a medium term implications are yet to be seen, but near term, hopefully, the focus on ISIS continues. Well, look, I think we're starting to get some great audience questions, as I should say. Folks can submit those through the live chat, and we will try to get through them. So, one I wanted to put on the table that I think fits into the broader conversation is, and I put it to each of you. What do you make around the sort of flirting with the idea of regime change and how that impacts potential negotiations between the United States and Iran? And relatedly to that, how do you all see this question of the lessons that Iran will learn from the military campaign about how it will approach the negotiations? And will it try to sprint for a weapon in private while it negotiates to buy time? Or do you think it'll be seriously committed because it'll perceive that the United States and Israel will continue with a military campaign until they believe they've degraded the program so sufficiently that it can't pose a threat to U.S. interests? And if I could start with you, Rachel, on that point, and then we'll go around the horn.
Sure. I think, and I hope, what we have seen for so many years from President Trump of his disinterest in getting the United States into a long war. And we heard him say very publicly and very clearly in Riyadh last month or 2 months ago, how the business of intervening in other countries' affairs and trying to remake countries that they know how to do better themselves is done, and not the direction he wants to go. So I think for the United States and this president, regime change is not the preferred approach. For Israel, I can see there being interest in regime change, but given what I said previously about sort of the challenge of a long war for them now too, particularly with Iran, coupled with all of the other challenges we've talked about, interceptors running low, economic concerns for Israel, the region, Gulf partners who don't want to be drawn into this war, regime change is really hard, and it's rarely successful when an external actor is the one who is pushing for it. I am hopeful that any urge there is to sort of capitalize on success and continue at the war on the part of Israel is curbed, whether by their own desire to calm things down a little bit. And, schools open today. Everything had ground to a halt in a way that's not sustainable for a very long time. I am hopeful that there's not the urge to go for regime change. But I think what happens as negotiations move forward and what Iran's posture is, you alluded to two very different options that we'll have to see which direction the Iranian regime goes, will have an impact on, does the war pick up again? And if so, what are the target sets? Do they remain relatively military, or do they start bleeding into more political and civilian infrastructure that suggests more than just trying to get at Iran's nuclear and military capabilities?
Liz, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with Rachel. I mean, look, I think we can look to the Houthi campaign that Trump announced in March to showcase just how unwilling Trump is to not just commit resourcing, but continue to sustain a campaign of that magnitude. I just don't see any scenario in which, I'm sure, talking about it, tweeting about it, it feels like a lot of empty threats to me. If we couldn't even continue to sustain the campaign against the Houthis, I just don't see how he could commit to resourcing regime change in Iran. I also think that the president is very swayed by the views of the Gulf leaders. It's very clear that his administration had one view of the Syrian government before he arrived in Riyadh, and he left announcing that he was lifting sanctions, and he had met with Shara on the margins of another meeting. So he's clearly very swayed by these arguments. I think the Gulf countries are really concerned about a protracted conflict, which regime change would be. And that could impact a lot of their economies, their diversification efforts, some of their critical infrastructure potentially. And then, of course, like, despite building up their own air defenses and U.S., led regional integration efforts, they do continue to see the U.S. as their best and most capable partner. But that doesn't mean, and obviously a weakened Iran for them is not necessarily a bad thing, but a destabilized Iran is a bad thing for them. So I think that if the president were actively pursuing that, the Gulf countries are very likely behind closed doors, adamantly requesting that he not.
I really appreciate that perspective on the Gulf partners. What do you think the Iranians are thinking right now as they prepare potentially to approach another round of negotiations with the U.S.?
So I couldn't tell you specifically what the Iranians are thinking, but I want to circle back to and echo the points that my colleagues made. And in thinking about bringing foreign policy home, President Trump, especially in his second presidential campaign, showed that he had his ear to the ground. He and his campaign, and he and his team, his family, had an ear to the ground with communities across the United States that have a lot of equities in the Middle East and in U.S. foreign policy. And while whoever the guests of the day at Mar-a-Lago may or may not sway the president today or tomorrow on a course of action, President Trump should be listening to what Iranian Americans are feeling right now, not just the folks who might have romantic memories of the Shah, but folks who are very critical of this Islamic regime that has been terrorizing Iranian civilians and, of course, civilians across the region, but who certainly don't want to see the United States to go to war with Iran, to see the U.S. drawn into a regime change war that may be prolonged and may draw in U.S. manpower and resources for years. We certainly don't think that the President Trump wants that to be his legacy. He knows that is a legacy killer for presidents. Among other communities that have deep equities and lots of thoughts about what's going on in the Middle East are the military and veterans community. The military today is training for a joint war-fighting concept that is focused on the Indo-Pacific and the pacing challenge posed by the People's Republic of China. We are not training for another regime change war in the Middle East. And if we want to talk about the stress put on military and veterans communities who have given generations of blood and treasure and time to the Middle East, I think many communities across the United States would expect a different approach from the Trump administration. And then lastly, I'll close with this. China, I think, would love nothing more than to see us bogged down in a regime change campaign in the Middle East.
Something you said, Adham, reminds me of another question that I wanted to try to get here. And Rachel, I'm hoping as a Hill veteran, you can enlighten us a little bit about how the conversation on Capitol Hill is playing out about the results of the last 2 weeks, and whether you think the discussion of potential war powers resolution votes will have any impact on Iranian or Israeli calculus in how they proceed over the next few months.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think war powers resolution or the congressional conversation will impact how Israel and Iran are thinking about things. It has hardly impacted how executive branch leadership has thought about things. And that is not unique to President Trump. That is the case for every successive administration since the last AUMF was passed in 2002. Congress does have the responsibility to declare war and oversee a presidential decision to use force. That responsibility has rarely been executed effectively. It is a conversation that's come up every few years. Every time there is either the potential for force that Congress wants to constrain or an active force where the administration needs to come justify what they're doing. And if they want to sustain that campaign, ask for permission. unless it is connected to one of the 2 authorizations for use of military force that are still on the books from 2001 and 2002, linked to Al-Qaeda. And so the conversation now is, I think, particularly interesting and particularly challenging. It's being led, for the most part, by the same voices who have tried to exercise this congressional responsibility for a long time. But because Prime Minister Netanyahu had already started the war, and this wasn't a case where the United States was looking to sort of start their own engagement, it was actually to get involved in another ongoing war, it has become a question not only about should the executive branch be taking the United States into war and using force, but to what extent should the United States be supporting Israel? And for a lot of the congressional conversation, that is a far more entrenched and challenging position politically than even where you stand on war powers. The latest resolution I saw, I think it was Senator Kaine and Senator Kim. I'm blanking on who else brought it to a bill recently, was trying to specify that this is not about defense of Israel. This is about future offensive U.S. action. So we'll see if bringing that nuance into the conversation gets the legislative process sort of moving at all. But it's a precarious position for members of Congress to take, not only on, do you want to curtail the Trump administration, particularly if you're a Republican, and do you want to be perceived as saying the U.S. shouldn't support Israel, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. So I don't really think it's going to go much farther this time around, but it's kind of reignited a conversation that we've seen come to the floor a few times recently, and which is an important conversation for Congress to be having about exercising its oversight responsibility. It's just a tough one politically.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it sort of remains to be seen how the conversation will evolve on the Hill. And my perspective is, and I totally agree with you, Rachel, that it's a really difficult position for members to be in because of the political implications. They're so long lasting. And there are things that are tied to people when they run for higher office as well. I mean, we can all recall the implications for Hillary Clinton having voted for the Iraq AUMF in 2002 and how that was used as something that was held against her in 2008. I mean, that's one example, but there are lots of other ones where how members of Congress, whether in the House or Senate, vote, the political implications are significant and long lasting for their record. So let me turn it back to some of the thinking about what's going on in the region and bring in another question from the audience, from this one from Tyler. Iran's military power was clearly greatly overestimated. Does this affect Israel's credibility and ability to command U.S. support going forward? Rachel, for you.
Yeah, I think even Israel was surprised how quickly they were able to achieve aerial superiority and take out Iran's missile defense. On the other hand, nobody has doubted Israel's military capabilities. It's kind of the what comes next. There is the split screen and contrast between Israel's spectacular failure with respect to October 7th and Gaza and their relative success relative to Hezbollah, and thus far with the operations in Iran. Whether they achieve success in taking out enough of Iran's nuclear program is a different question, but it was a pretty targeted and right now limited campaign that was executed well. They have proven to have pretty well entrenched and fairly exquisite intelligence capabilities. Some of the operations they've conducted from a military and intelligence perspective have been very impressive. None of that is, so I think what they've been able to achieve has been surprising, but that they have good military capabilities is not surprising to anyone. It's how do you turn these tactical victories into sort of the strategic wins that you talked about in your opening. Sort of, there are tremendous opportunities to remake alliances, relationships, the general architecture of diplomacy and economic relationships in the Middle East. I leave out military because I think that transformation has already been happening. But that needs to be through diplomatic means, not through military means. So I say that to answer the question. I don't think what we've seen militarily from Israel will impact their ability to command U.S. forces. I think for President Trump, in getting involved in this war was a means to an end. Some of that end was ending the war, bringing it to a faster close because he didn't want it to drag on. And ultimately, he still talks about this vision of expanding the Abraham Accords, bringing Saudi-Israeli normalization back to the table, right? Sort of remaking the Middle East in ways that could be possible with the right deals, but having to end some of these wars, to include the Gaza war, and we'll see what happens there, are steps toward that end. And I think for President Trump, so too was the military involvement in this past Iran war.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think there's an interesting question as we think about this discussion around strategic competition. And this is bringing in also another user question about defense cooperation between Tehran and Moscow that has revealed itself as primarily the transfer of military and technical knowledge as opposed to a formal defense partnership. Adham, I'd love to know from you if you foresee any conditions in the current framework of the Iran-Israeli conflict that would pull Russia in beyond their established military cooperation, which we've seen has been somewhat limited.
Certainly. Well, I think we saw a couple of what one would think are red lines for Vladimir Putin in the region over the last 18 months. One being the fall of the Assad regime. We didn't exactly see Russia come to the aid of Assad in his final hour, certainly helped facilitate his exile now in Moscow. But Russia invested a lot of political capital, blood and treasure in its Syria campaign, with, of course, the strategic objective of having a foothold in the Arab heartlands, as well as a warm water port on the Eastern Med. Iran is Russia's was the other principal ally for Russia in the region. And now we have seen sort of what the value of having Vladimir Putin as an ally is, which is in your worst hour, don't count on Moscow. Again, I think the United States' strategic adversaries would love nothing more than to see us bogged down in a long-term, prolonged conflict in the Middle East, whether that's a Strait of Hormuz scenario, whether that is a regime change war, if Netanyahu tries to pull the United States into that, the United States will bear those costs, and Russia will be free to do even more of what it's doing in Ukraine and Europe, and be able to focus on rebuilding its own defense industrial capacity. I'll also say that on the one side, you see what the integrity of the so-called axis of resistance, or our dear colleague Jonathan Lord, the axis of upheaval, as he would call it. You see what the strength of that has looked like over the last 18 months. On the flip side, we have had military operational and tactical successes, United States, Israel, and its Arab regional partners. But we also found the U.S. Standing alone, holding the bag, essentially, bearing the costs in terms of security and reputation in the region. We saw this in the Red Sea during Red Sea operations, where even though the Yemeni Houthis' malign behavior in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden were in essentially Arab waterways, you didn't see Arab navies rushing to publicly support those campaigns. You also saw the EU essentially stand up their own defensive maritime escort Operation SPDs, which didn't contribute to cohesion within the NATO alliance. And again, saw the United States and the UK as well, sort of standing alone as a coalition of the willing. That's not sort of the place that the United States wants to be. So I think in looking at what the next weeks and months look like, the United States should continue to focus on shoring up our alliances by also, again, lowering the cost of doing business with the United States.
I really appreciate that perspective from you on that, Adham. I know we're running up against time here. We've got 5 minutes left. So what I want to do to wrap up the conversation and kind of bring some conclusions to the fore is ask each of you to take a moment to sort of talk about one key takeaway you'd like to leave the audience with about where you think we're going in the next 60 to 90 days. And Liz, if I could start with you, that would be great.
Sure. So, of course, we want to get back to diplomacy and negotiations. That requires the United States being engaged in a way that is not just military forward. I think we were really optimistic about the Trump administration's pursuit of those partnerships in mid-May when he visited the Gulf. I think that optimism has dwindled a little bit over the last couple of weeks. But in order for us to get back to that and sort of pursue these new regional partnerships that are transforming from security partnerships to economic partnerships, it's time for us to really focus and hone in on that. Otherwise, we risk potentially losing these billions, what Trump calls trillions of dollars of deals that have been announced from his trip. I would think that given the potential benefits for the US economy and for the global economy, that is something we want to put the focus back on. So I think for me, the diplomacy comes first. And hopefully that means not just diplomacy with our regional partners, but also back to the negotiation table with Iran.
Thanks so much. Adham, what would you like to leave our audience with today?
So I'll say that the past 18 months in the post-October 7th chapter, a chapter punctuated by the so-called 12-day war and the Trump administration strikes on Iran's nuclear infrastructure, may have fundamentally altered the regional balance in ways that create genuine opportunities for the United States if we have the political will and disciplined policy making to seize them. For years, we've heard the refrain that there is, quote, no military solution to Middle East conflicts. I think from Syria to Iran, that maxim has proven false. In Syria, Vladimir Putin saw a military solution. So did Qasem Soleimani. So did Hassan Nasrallah. And so did Ahmed al-Shara. In Damascus and beyond, kinetic military action has certainly changed political calculations across the region. In one reading, that's a potentially more dangerous Middle East. In President Trump's reading, there's, quote, unquote, peace through strength. President Trump has expended immense political capital, as Dan noted, and national assets in the first 6 months of his second administration. In Riyadh, as Rachel was sharing, in Riyadh last month, our counterparts in the region largely welcomed the Trump administration's "Commerce, not Chaos" slogan, which focused on the economic and technological progress and potential in the region, not just in the Arab Gulf, but also in the new Levant. The hope now is whether Trump's approach in the Middle East will enable the stabilizing conditions in the regional security environment and keep malign actors at bay. This requires comprehensive, whole-of-government policy formulation that factors in tools of statecraft such as aid and development and humanitarian assistance and technical expertise on stabilization and good governance. And frankly, the US has shot itself in the knee by allowing President Trump, Elon Musk, and Secretary Rubio to gut the US Agency for International Development and key offices at the Department of State, as well as letting go a deep bench of personnel with institutional knowledge of the Middle East after decades of US involvement there.
Thanks, Adham. Really important perspective. Rachel, if you could bring us home, I'd be grateful.
Thank you. I would echo both my colleagues and want to pick up on what Liz was talking about with respect to diplomacy. I think I am hopeful that I'll be watching for do negotiations resume with whom are new actors, particularly from the region and Europe, brought in. Previously, the US, Iran, although they were indirect, were more sort of attempt at bilateral conversation about what is a much more regional and international challenge. And I think we will see President Trump reminded again, as he has been, that other leaders have a vote. And his tendency is sort of to set out his direction and try and push people into it. I would say bully people into it often, but that doesn't always work. And we've seen that it doesn't work. So how adept is he and his administration at getting people to recognize that their own interests are in achieving a diplomatic solution, coming to a place where they can take advantage of all of these dynamic relationships in the Middle East, dynamic situations in each country that have the potential to move in a much better strategic direction, or can sort of remain in this, I've forgotten about the commerce, not chaos, but in this really chaotic place that is threatening not only to each country and their societies, but to Israel, to the United States, to the interests of all of our partners in the region who genuinely want stability for the sake of prosperity, for the sake of sort of being able to move ahead. So we'll see where the next 60 to 90 days goes.
Thank you, Rachel, for that. And I'd first like to say thank you to all of our panelists and to CNAS for hosting what I think has been a rich discussion, and to all of you for tuning in. And we look forward to doing more of this